Hey guys, thanks for joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. If you're a returning listener, it's great to have you back. If you're a new listener, we're glad you're here. We hope you like the channel. So, our podcast is for people that want to learn something new or make themselves a little bit better every day. So, we talk about a wide range of topics, but we tend to focus on kind of personal responsibility, controlling our emotions, making left brain, fact based, logical decisions, and making the world a better place by having good interactions with people and showing leadership. So, in today's episode, we're going to talk about a pretty dark chapter in government relations with people and the government lying to the public. And what stemmed us thinking about this was we've seen a lot of conversations around RFK Jr. and his approach to the healthcare system and the food system in the United States. And the argument from our perspective isn't is RFK Jr. right? Is RFK Jr. wrong? Blah, blah, blah. The whole point of this should be to have a fact based conversation around things in these systems and see if there are things that need to be improved. So there's been a lot of conversations around vaccines. There's been a lot of conversations around additives in food. And it seems like there is a pretty big rush from people that are already entrenched in power or have a big financial stake in the way the system is set up today to shut the conversation down. And our argument would be if there's no problems, it shouldn't be any problem to look at the facts and let the facts and the data allow us to make good decisions. But there seems to be a big push by a lot of people. They get emotional about this topic and they want to stop this conversation from happening. So, if vaccines are good, and full disclosure, I've been vaccinated completely from childhood. So, I got the polio vaccine, I got the MMT, everything you get as a kid, I got. My kids got all of those. But we look at the way the COVID vaccine was pushed on the American public, and it reminds us very much of this situation that we're going to talk about here. So, this situation we're going to talk about here is the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And this was done through the federal government in conjunction with the Tuskegee Institute back in the 1930s. And so when you think about where the country was at that point, we were still pretty entrenched in Jim Crow, Plessy v. Ferguson, which is where separate but equal had been created, which allowed Jim Crow racism to run rampant largely in the southern part of the country. Was still absolutely entrenched. It was not two more decades in 1954 until Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and said, no, separate and equal is not equal. Everyone is equal. And so that was kind of where we were as a country. It was not a good spot as a country, and we were disenfranchising and treating people with dark colored skin different simply because they had dark colored skin. So not good. So the Public Health Service, which was kind of the overarching medical body at the time for the federal government, worked with the Tuskegee Institute, and they wanted to do a study on the natural course of syphilis, of all things. And so what they did was they wanted to find black men who had syphilis and essentially monitor how it worked in their bodies. And so they set this up under the guise of, we're offering you free healthcare. You can come see our doctors for free. And they tested and found 600 men. 399 of these black men had syphilis, and 201 of them did not. That 201 is the control group to compare to the 399 that did have syphilis. So promise things like free medical exams, meals, burial insurance. So, I mean, when you're offering free burial insurance, that should tell you that you're not involved in a great thing. With all that said, I'm not blaming in any way the people who were involved in this study. They were lied to, they were deceived, they trusted the federal government, as many people do. And that's kind of our argument is you should be very skeptical of the federal government because the federal government has many instances like this in its past where they have intentionally lied to people to push a narrative, to further what they call research or progress or national security is another big one that they'll wrap a blanket around something and say, well, it's in the best interest of national security. So there's been tons of instances like this. We're focused on this one today. So these men that did have syphilis, they knew they didn't feel right. And they were told they had bad blood. It's just a vague term, just a doctor, but a doctor saying you've got bad blood. People tend to believe doctors when they tell them something. And you can believe doctors, you cannot believe doctors. We're big fans of understanding fully any diagnosis you get from a doctor. So when these guys were told they had bad blood, they were given medicine. Well, it turns out that medicine were things like aspirin and tonic. And even after, so this started in 1932, and in 1947, it became pretty evident that penicillin could cure syphilis. And even after, in 1947, when it was discovered that penicillin would cure syphilis, it was withheld intentionally from these men to continue this study. So it's a pretty slimy thing, and it's a good example of why it's important to get to the facts. We should not be shutting down conversations simply because we don't agree with the premise of the conversation or the premise of the accusation, if you want to call it that, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of controversy around the components in vaccines that could be, or the argument is, a better way to say it, the argument is that those components have a negative health impact on children when they're given these vaccines, or adults when they're given these vaccines. And if that is true, we should know that there's a potential for these side effects. We should not be blindly following these. This is good no matter what. It's worth the juice is worth the squeeze. And we should be allowed to make our own health decisions for our own bodies and decide what makes sense to us or for our kids. And so these guys were never given that opportunity. They were lied to. Even when there was a cure that was discovered, it was withheld from them. And they were misled to keep them in the study, even with doctors going so far as to discourage these men from getting second opinions, seeing a doctor outside of this network. It's crazy. It's crazy that this happened, but this absolutely happened. This is documented fact. There's been lots. In fact, President Clinton apologized to this group, and there was a settlement in the 70s to this group from the federal government paying them for this deception and the unconscionable treatment that they suffered at the hands of the U.S. government. So even in internal reports where this is a small controlled group of people, in internal reports, they were publishing that the study was beneficial, that it was having good health benefits, that it was leading them to discover things that hadn't been discovered before, and just not true, just false. And there were ethical objections raised by people outside of the study that doctors either ignored or dismissed. And it was crazy. There was many men in the study died from syphilis or complications from syphilis. They infected family members. If you're a man with syphilis and you sleep with your wife, you can give your wife syphilis at some point. And there were children that were born with congenital defects from syphilis from these men that were in this study. So it's pretty crazy. So this started in 1932, and it wasn't until 1972 that a whistleblower called it out. There's a guy named Peter Buxton, and he leaked the details of the study to the press. And the story was broken by the Associated Press. And as soon as it was broke, there was outrage rightfully everywhere. The initial response, in typical government fashion, was to downplay the study's harm, claiming it provided significant insight. What insight? Never been surfaced. Nobody's ever actually pointed to, hey, this is what we learned from this study, and this is the good that came from this study of lying to these men and telling them that they were getting medical care when they were in fact being treated like lab rats and being observed instead of treated for their illnesses. And the government started destroying evidence, started destroying documents. And they didn't want anyone to see what they had done because they knew how wrong it was. And again, typical government fashion. So if you are the subject of a lawsuit, if you are the subject of a criminal investigation, you're required by the court to not destroy evidence, to turn over any evidence that you have to the government so that they can use it to build a case against you. But if you work for the federal government and you destroy this evidence, rarely are there repercussions for that. So it's a crazy double standard. It's 100% illegal, but it happens very frequently. And this is an example where we have proof that it happened. And there were further investigations. So once this came out, there was public outrage and there were Senate investigations. And the Senate investigations exposed deliberate cover-ups and the systemic racism of why wasn't this targeted at white men? Why wasn't this targeted at Italian men or Irish men or Mexican men? It was black men that were chosen on purpose. And there were internal memos that were discovered that showed discussions on how to stop people from finding out about this, how to stop discussion from happening on this, and how to avoid the scrutiny that was coming their way. So this was still going in 1972 when this leak came out, and it was ended in 1972. So for 40 years, we were lying to these men and allowing them to live with syphilis. It's insane. It's just crazy. But this absolutely happened. You don't have to take my word for it. You can Google Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and you'll see all of the evidence that I'm talking about. So this is one of the reasons why African American people don't trust the government. They have a good reason not to trust the government. There was a story that we saw, I think it was CNN, if I remember right, that followed several people from the CDC that were going door to door and knocking on doors during the pandemic talking about COVID shots. And they were in African American communities. And a lot of African American people said, I'm not taking a shot from the government. You have no proof that this works. You haven't shown me that it's not detrimental to my health. I have good reason not to trust the U.S. government. And I'm not taking this this vaccine. It's a shot. It's not a vaccine if it doesn't stop the spread of the disease. If it doesn't prevent the disease, it's not a vaccine. Like if you get a polio shot, you won't get polio. That's been well established for decades now. If you get a measles, mumps, rubella shot, you don't get measles or mumps or rubella. Those are vaccines. A shot, the COVID shot, is like a flu shot. And we should stop calling it a vaccine because it's not a vaccine. It's just not true. So supposedly, or allegedly, however you want to say it, stricter ethical guidelines such as the Belmont Report and the establishment of internal review boards or institutional review boards to oversee things like this to prevent them from happening again. That sounds great, but I think there's a lot of evidence that's out now that shows our NIH was illegally funding COVID research at the Wuhan Institute for Virology, and that is likely where the pandemic started because of this research. So before any tinfoil hat crazy conspiracy theorists, or you want to paint us as tinfoil hat crazy conspiracy theorists, I don't think that this was released on the public intentionally. I think it was a mistake. But there's little doubt in my mind that it started in that lab. Every other outbreak of a respiratory disease like Ebola, like SARS, like West Nile virus, those all could be traced back to a host animal that started the pandemic. That's never happened with COVID, and with all of the fear and cleavage sites that really don't look natural according to biochemists and people that do this for a living. There's just too much evidence that suggests that it's a coincidence that the outbreak happened 2 blocks from a lab that was studying and creating or doing gain of function research to create these types of viruses. So this isn't new. The COVID thing is not new. This has happened before, where the government has lied to people to do what they call work for the greater good. But we should be very skeptical of those things, and we should push to have open, fully transparent dialogue around any of these types of topics that affect all of our health. So that's kind of what our call to action is don't let people silence conversations. If there is nothing wrong, if it's 100% safe, if there is no issues, if nothing could happen, then there shouldn't be any problem to having an open, fully transparent conversation around the facts of anything. And until we do that, we're not going to believe anybody. It doesn't matter if it's someone from the federal government. We want proof that what you're telling us is the truth. And if you're so certain, if it's you're so sure that this can happen, or you're so sure that you've got the solution, you're so sure that there's no negative side effects, you shouldn't worry at all about having a conversation about this and being challenged by other subject matter experts who know the same things that you know, and you should be able to refute or debunk any false evidence, any what we love, the misinformation. Misinformation is turned into, I don't like it. It doesn't support the narrative that I am pushing, so I'm going to label it as misinformation. And there's been too many recent examples. Joe Biden's mental health, right? He's never been better. The young people have trouble keeping up with him. We can't verify it's Hunter Biden's laptop. Russia colluded with Trump to steal the 2016 election. All sorts of just blatant lies that have been told to us. And we got to stop allowing it to happen. We have to force these transparent, fact-based conversations. And then we can make our decisions. Maybe we do all this work and say, you know what? Like we told you, all these vaccines, no problems with them whatsoever. Awesome. That's great. No problems with that. But there should be open and transparent conversations around this stuff. And again, this is not new. The study we're citing happened almost 100 years ago now. So this is not a new thing for the government. It is not new that they will, and they is the people that work in the government, the bureaucrats that work in the government. If you notice, these things are rarely done by elected officials. The elected officials make laws. They create these agencies, these bureaucracies, and you have appointed, not publicly voted in, but appointed bureaucrats who wind up in positions of power and authority. And it's very easy for those people to abuse these positions of power and authority. And we would argue they actually think they're doing something for the greater good. People tend to get so myopic and so focused on what they think is the greater good that they will lie and withhold information that makes it harder for them to push the narrative that they want to push. And we can't allow that to happen anymore. It's done. I think that's one of the outcomes of this election is people are tired of being told there's no problems at the southern border. Your life isn't actually more expensive. You just don't understand how economics works. Bullshit. We know exactly how economics works. When I get paid and I go buy groceries, I have less money left to pay my rent and put gas in my car and buy insurance and all the other things that I have to do to run my life. So we need to remember that this has happened over and over again and refuse to allow it to keep happening. That's our responsibility as citizens in a democratic republic. So that's the episode for today, guys. Hope you learned something from this. Hope we were able to maybe make you think about it a little bit differently. And again, we're not advocating for or against any of these positions. What we're advocating for is honest, fact-based, fully transparent conversations so we can all have the evidence we need to make good decisions for ourselves and the people around us. So we hope you'll join us in doing those same things, because if we all demand it, it will happen. It will happen if we all demand it. So don't forget, guys, every day James puts it up right over here. We've got, go to our website, saltygingertalk.com. All of our podcast episodes are available there. All of our, social media links are available there. And we publish a newsletter every weekday that you can subscribe to there. We're also excited. We've got some guests coming up on the podcast starting in January. So we've got 4 people lined up to have interviews with, to talk about their lives, how they approach things, challenges that they face and overcome, what the coping mechanisms are they use to build successful lives and fight through adversity. And so we're really excited about bringing those episodes to you. We'll start publishing those in January. But for now, hope you like this episode. We'll keep publishing good stuff, and we hope it makes you think differently. That's the goal. Think critically, run your life the way you want it run. Don't let somebody else run it for you. So, all right, guys, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.